All right, everybody. So we're going to go ahead and get back to the um, lectures of that have to do with media and education. And specifically, we're going to talk about the Being Indigenous chapter, talking about Inuit knowledge. So, and knowledge-based learning systems. So we're going to go ahead and share my screen. All right. So this is called The Staying Force of Inuit Knowledge. The author is over here. And this is one of the statues that he talks about. And here's more examples of those. Talk about those in just a second. And here's another example of him. Cool thing about him that I added at the bottom. You're not obligated to look at this, but I think it's really cool. He is working with survivors of sexual violence that happened in the school that he was kidnapped and made to attend because he was forced to attend one of the Indian schools in the that was part of the Roman Catholic residential school system. And it had a priest in it that was abusive to a good portion of children. And so he actually has helped take up that cause and help try to bring justice, including even talking to the Pope and trying to get him to expedite that priest to Canada so that they can be tried for those crimes. However, I do not believe that actually happened. I think the Pope gave his apologies and went on his way, which happens regularly to those who experience that kind of religious harm. All right. The author's background again, he was kidnapped at age 11 in August of 1958 and thrown into the Roman Catholic residential school. This is the school he actually attended, and they slept in tents outside, and they were hit, not hot, sorry. They were hit for speaking their indigenous language at any point. They would be hit and struck with rulers. And so when he got to come back into his culture, he really he remembered what his parents had taught him, and he wanted to continue on some of those traditions, and he wanted to get back to the culture that he counted as his, that he got to choose, as opposed to one that was chosen for him. And this particular chapter is kind of talking about essentially Inuit knowledge, the ways in which colonialism kind of has impacted those, and the ways in which those are getting carried on or perhaps in danger of being carried on. So a little bit about Inuit people. Their language is very vital to their way of life. They live a very seasonal cycle of living. They're nomadic, and they accessed vast lands that are down here in 4 different countries that are US, Canada, Greenland, and the Soviet Union. In the 1960s, the Canadian government took them from these regions and essentially plopped them down into this particular area and told them to make do, kind of similar to the way we in the US put indigenous people onto reservations. The problem here was that they were hunter-gatherers and very much sharing and community, and women were very much a very integral part of this. So when Christian-based ideologies came through, and these government-based ideologies that really discredited or had women as kind of second-class citizens and forced them off their lands, that they already had cycles of where they were in any given part of the year, depending on what it was, the resource they were gathering or hunting, really influenced their way of life. And they ended up having to be dependent on a lot of government aid due to the fact that their entire way of life was based on the land and based on the type of the season at which they were experiencing that land and becoming a part of it. So again, they were hunter-gatherers, so they had to know those areas very well. In the fall, it was very geared towards fishing char and hunting caribou. as they were roaming the area. Fall was the best time to hunt caribou, he said, because they would be the fattest from snacking during spring and summer. And then as winter approached, they would use their caches of meat, or essentially they would put meat into stone containers, not containers, stone. Basically, they would make stone basins inside or around the earth, put the meat in it, close it up, and then pack it with snow around it. So they made essentially their own freezers or their own coolers so that they could cache or keep the meat during the winter. All of the products they stored, and those were all the products they stored during the harsh times. During spring, they would do seal hunting, and they would be working on drying out some of their caribou meat. Again, this would help them get through the harsher winter months. And then in summer, they would do a lot of fishing, and then depending on migration patterns of the fish, and then they would do a lot of dry fishing. And it was cool because he talked about when he was fishing, they didn't use hooks. Instead, they would like make little lures that looked like fish that were carved out of stone and stuff. And the fish would come investigate, and then they would spear the fish at the top of the surface when they would come investigate. But if you overshot or you didn't really think through how deep that fish was, then you would miss. So it was something that took a lot of precision. And these were kinds of things that you had to learn how to do, right? You had to learn how to process the seal. You had to learn how to make clothing. You had to learn how to use and dry these foods out. You had to learn how to dry out the berries and make with the fat and make them into like the bars that they made. Like these were things and processes that are learning ways that are very much part of their culture and part of their knowledge-based systems. And so this is just another form of a way of thinking about knowledge, because when we think about it as just reading, writing, and math, then we take away the ways in which knowledge changes and varies depending on culture. And so for them, not knowing how to spear a fish in those fishing circles and cut into the ice is like a really big deal. Whereas someone sitting in the US school system would be like, well, I don't know how to do that, but that's okay because I don't have to. And that, again, a difference in what culturally we determine is knowledge and is a value to learn is something that very much is varied. And that's kind of the point I want to make in expressing this. I thought it was interesting that they talked about how Inuit people, they talked about the mosquitoes during the summer, which we all dislike. Most of us, I don't know anyone, I've never met anyone that personally loves mosquitoes, but I'm sure they are out there. But I think it's interesting that they talk about a very big phobia of bugs as Inuit people. And that makes sense to me, given the climate that they live in. There's probably not a lot of them at any given time. I've always lived in very humid places that have moderate winters. And so bugs were just part of life. So it's very interesting to see the different dynamics, but also interesting to see that because this is something that they fear and something that they consider of strength, that is still something that they will name people after. And he talked about, I think it was his sister who was named after bees, I believe. And that once after her passing, when he would see those creatures, he would feel closer to his sister, which I thought was really cool. They talked a lot about naming practices that they were very incredibly important to the Inuit, that it could carry on the life of someone. So like he talked about his grandfather and how many people inherited that name specifically to kind of carry on their grandfather's life and to carry on that practice. And it also shows how well liked he was, given how many people were named after that. And that resonated because that's a custom that even now we do, right? We take names and take them as generationally when we have people in our lives that we are very fond of, right? Or names that carry on. You have a lot of middle names that carry on. I'm named after my granny, who is no longer around, but her name was Annie. And even though Anne was my middle name, Annie is what I always went by, specifically because of her. And so you can see how like names are valuable and they trace on through lineages. And it's something that is interesting how that takes shape in other cultures. They also talk about names that can require the continued success. So they talked about like really successful people. When children are given those names of really successful people, they're expected to be as successful or more successful than that person that had that name prior. And then they talked about names that are tied especially to nature, the nature around them, the animals, the places, and to spirits and uh, spirituality type mythos names and things of that nature. And then they also, I love that they talk about adoption. So the fact that adoption is very prevalent in Inuit culture, and a lot of that, from what I've read previously in anthropology classes, has to do with the extreme risk that comes with living in climates that are harsh. And so needing a system where kinship can be tied into adoption, so that that way if people who didn't have the resources or couldn't or were unable to provide or weren't providing or what have you, had the ability to lend over, the elders could, he talked a lot about the elders being able to also give you people to adopt, and that adoption was a very big part of their culture. And I think that that's really awesome, because I think so often here in the US um, we talk about child rearing and just family in general as this very biological thing. However, if we got into more of an understanding that family is more tied to who you give your time, energy, and commitment to, then I think we would have a better system that worked for being able to provide care for children, as opposed to and nurturing and loving and time, as opposed to um, a lot of children experiencing abuse and neglect due to the fact that, or just resource scarcity, due to the fact that there's this biologically driven idea of um, parenthood and of child rearing. They talked about storytelling through place, which I loved this part of this, where they would make, and he talks, he's standing next to one here, and there's some up here, but these statues in places where they have been, and essentially it does two things. One, it denotes that they have been somewhere, and two, it also allows people, other Inuit people, to feel a sense of place when someone else visits there. I also think it's awesome that he talked about how he can remember his mom saying not to ever knock one down because that'll bring death to you earlier. And I think it is interesting to me um, to talk about the ways in which the morals of stories and things of that nature we tie into um, the stories we tell our children, right? And I think that for him, the fact that this one stuck, um, and the fact that it weighed so heavily on them culturally, I hope is something that will then stick with you guys, so that if you ever see one of these at any capacity, you leave them be and don't knock them down. He also talked about healing processes and traditional medication, and the different ways in which they healed certain ailments, and using certain skins over boils and things that would have anti-inflammatory properties and things of that nature, naturally, to kind of heal basic wounds. I do wonder if the moss thing works actually on diarrhea, or if that would make it worse. Something it's interesting to me, the natural medicines, because so many of our medication processes in modern medicine stem from the indigenous properties of plants and the indigenous practices that utilize those plants. So he also talks about songs. He talks about the hunter song, and really that they were stories of telling about self. And gonna do some editing while I'm doing this. And she talked about the drum dances and how so many of the youth were very interested in the drum dances, but not so interested in the singing and the telling of the stories that go behind the drum dances, and that the elders were worried that there wouldn't be anybody to tell the stories next, which I think is interesting. They also talked about legends. So again, these are like akin to their fairy tales. So their story about morals, their stories about lessons, and ways in which for the adults to transcribe or impose cultural norms on the youth. And that's pretty common throughout many cultures, whether they are verbally told legends or they are legends that are written down. And then the social consequences for the Inuit just of being where they are, and the ways in which government and colonialistic processes have impacted them. They experience a lot of addiction, depression, suicide. They have a lot of language transformation, which I think is interesting because it's becoming one Inuit language as opposed to they had a lot of varying dialects, and that language seems to be losing its dialect. Dialectical, I don't know if that's a word, differences essentially from different regions due to the fact that there are less people speaking those languages, and when they do speak them, it tends to be in um, communication with people that would normally have a different dialect. So because of the rarity, you're seeing a lot more of just one version of that language and trying to carry that on. And then they're having a lot of he talks a lot about engaging the youth in cultural practices and making sure that they can do that. I think it's interesting that he's actually an indigenous art teacher, and so he actually makes drums. He does. You can see him here. He's working. He's in one of the igloos, and also apparently English people spell igloos wrong. It is not IGLOO. It is IGLU. That is the way in which Inuit individuals spell igloo. And I think that that, again, is language matters, right? It's a difference between using the colonialistic interpretation of a word that was written down versus the um, form of the word that is used by the people who have those practices. But again, I encourage you to check this out. I really think that this piece is really just talking about the ways in which knowledge systems are different and the ways in which language are so valuable in some of these knowledge systems. Um, so I'm going to stop there and I will be back in just a few and we'll talk about one of the other articles.